Hello, good afternoon. So, identity is a very precious commodity, right? And groups act together in order to defend that identity. And usually that defense of identity manifests violently. This is not always the case. Hizmet is an exception to this policy. And it's because it fosters empathy. Empathy is bridging those gaps of disconnectedness. And Hizmet is an exceptional model for creating individuals and groups with a dramatic amount of empathy, which is a great step towards ending collective violence. And so it disengages violent processes, violent identity formations, formation boundaries. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, how Hizmet's different from other collective identity groups, and which processes it actually disengages and engages, and also give some talking points about how the group can progress further in its positive sort of empathetic structures. So violence, manifests from several interlocking sources. My theoretical model identifies those three sources as cultural knowledge, social order, and circumstances. Now, these three sources combined create the foundation of any identity, and they also determine a group's propensity for violence or a group's propensity for altruism. Here I am going to focus on several sources or several components of the cultural knowledge component, because culture is so embedded. And those are inclusion and exclusion, twinness, self-doubt, and dehumanization. These are the four components that are part of cultural knowledge. Now, cultural knowledge is basically made up of shared perceptions and collective thoughts that a community holds to. It is provided by the mechanism of culture, and it is a source for all group knowledge. Now, whereas I'm referring to culture, it's also encompassing religion, because religion is a major part of culture. Religion and culture inform one another. And our New Age term is culture, whereas it would have been referred to years ago as religion. So here they're one and the same, although they can be distinguished, but they do inform each other and create group knowledge. Now, Islam, regional ethnic traditions, and national heritage have fused together, to create Hizmet identity, what I refer to as Hizmet identity. I'm not creating a monolithic identity for everybody, but since we are talking about collectives, it is, formed from, like I said, regional traditions, religion, and national heritage, which is very strong within the Hizmet group. So my synthesized theoretical model has to do with social goal theory, which is a psychosocial model for understanding genocide, created by Irvin Staub, who was a psychosocial theorist. And it synthesizes the model, the total model, combines Mark Juergensmeyer's cultural concept of cosmic war for understanding religious terrorism. So the goal here is, the theoretical model is to understand how we get to that place of mass violence, how groups move in that direction. And so social goal theory is a theory that purports that every group has goals, and how those goals are determined is determined by the identity. And how is identity determined? By the goals. So it's this reciprocal and perpetual process of identity formation that social goal theory is trying to address. So identity determines the inclusion and exclusion of future goals, ideals, and behaviors. And those future goals, ideals, and behaviors, they dictate the person's identity. It's this give and take, this push and pull that keeps us always changing and always forming our identity. So identity is not stagnant. It's not this thing that we all just carry around with us or we have in our back pocket. It is a continual process. It changes all the time. And we need to keep that in mind. So, and cultural perceptions refers to how a group sees itself, how a group views its own history, and also how it views the world. So when we take those things into account, if a group views the world as already violent, then they're more likely to engage in violence, because they view their own violent actions as reactionary. And if a group has traumatic cultural memories that they carry with them as a collective, and they frame those memories in a way that informs their identity as victims and engages, humiliatory processes. So all they know about their history is that it was humiliation. Groups are moved, to basically participate in violence in order to gain empowerment, to overcome that humiliation. And so cultural traumatic memory, how they identify within themselves as a group, and how they view the world, it all helps to create these self and external perceptions that move us to violence or move us away from violence. So just a quick note on my methodology. The way that I obtained my data was through in-depth interviews, largely located in Southern California with the Pacifica Institute. And it was an equal number of men and women. The interviews lasted around sometimes an hour and a half to 2 hours, so they were quite lengthy. And so the data is very situated, though. I want to make you understand that this is not, I'm not talking about Hizmet in totality. I'm talking about Hizmet in Southern California specifically and the United States, because the United States community, the American community, their culture has manifested certain instances within Hizmet identity here specifically. So it's not applicable to, in a specific sense, to Hizmet in other countries. So this research is highly situated. So authenticity, the search for a legitimate, distinctive identity, is what drives us to sort of push other people away and also to bring other people in. It's that inclusion and exclusionary processes that basically form our identity. Like I said, what determines our goals and our behaviors. So shared knowledge is what constitutes important and valuable group ideals, okay? And it socializes individuals with beliefs and practices and behaviors accepted by the group. Okay, that's how the collective gets formed. That's how those bonds get formed. It basically says, like I said, what we are and what we are not. It creates the us-them dichotomy, and it's what happens when we other someone or another group, when we exclude them. We exclude them from the moral domain. Our moral domain is comprised of people who we see as us, other human beings, essentially, right? And so when we other someone, they're not human, they're not part of our circle, we don't apply our morals to them. So they're not subject to our same processes of morality. And that has to do with the exclusionary process. Now this is fostered due to largely negative stereotypes, propaganda, and that's how we create us, and that's how we create them, that's how we define what we are and what we are not. So it's not necessarily always othering another group, it's just defining what we're not that sometimes leads to these exclusionary identity formation processes. So it can be a very simple, it's usually a subconscious process. Oh, I don't like that, or I don't want that. And that can roll into these very negative stereotypes. And these get reinforced by people holding on to them throughout their lives without going ahead and getting the right information. They don't engage with what they see as different or what they have excluded, so they hold on to those misconceptions. Values and beliefs of Hizmet have created this fabric, centered on inclusion instead of exclusion, which is why Hizmet's so exceptional. And Lokman, one of my informants, and all these names are obviously pseudonyms, all faiths are welcome. We are reaching out to all people in the community. So they don't rely on negative stereotypes. They don't believe the propaganda. They're saying, okay, people are telling us about these people. I'm gonna go out and find out for myself. That stops that exclusionary process. That stops that fear from the unknown and moves Hizmet past that basic exclusionary process. So real human interaction, which Hizmet is involved in, really stops those negative identity formation processes that are so important in order to build peace. However, through my interviews, there was one bone of contention in this exclusionary-inclusionary process. There was a tendency for Hizmet members to reach out more so to Abrahamic faith communities, Jews and Christians, because they're relying on sort of those similarities in the Abrahamic faiths. And this has the effect, unfortunately, because it can't exist, the what we are can't exist without the what we are not. So it's we are part of the Abrahamic faith community, okay? But it others other religions, other religious groups like Buddhists and Hindus. And so that tendency I think the Hizmet movement is sort of at a fulcrum point, where it can actually move past it. So if we bring this to their attention, which is my goal, they can actually start to reach out more to those other faith communities and rely more on fostering an appreciation for those differences, instead of relying on those similarities between Abrahamic faiths to go ahead and foster relationships. Now, this also has largely to do with the fact that America is largely a Christian country, so we have to keep that in mind. But like in California, maybe some more outreach, Hizmet could focus on non-Abrahamic faith traditions in order to stop that exclusionary process, that unconscious exclusionary process. So twinness is what I refer to as, some of you may be familiar with René Girard's monstrous double. And it basically states that sometimes what a group devalues the most and pushes away from itself is not someone who's different, not something that they don't know, but it's something that is actually very close to home, someone who's too similar. And so what happens is they other Muslims. There's not that inclusiveness of other ethnic Muslims because they're so close to home. Hizmet has this tendency to set themselves up as the good Muslims, the Muslims who are moderate, who are based on Sufism, who don't engage in violence, and so other ethnic Muslims. And what happens is they actually engage Islamophobia. When their true goal is to end Islamophobia, which they feel is increasing in the United States, they actually end up increasing it and engaging Islamophobia and adding to that sort of frenzy. And what they really want to do is disengage it. So my other suggestion is that, based on my data, they should really reach out to other ethnic Muslims, allow them to see the model that Hizmet is using. And I know this is also largely reactionary because of America's, terrorism policies and things like that. So it's not all on Hizmet, right? It's not all their fault. But they can go ahead and disengage America's Islamophobia, and it's because of Hizmet's flexibility. Hizmet is so flexible that I'll skip this slide. It actually is able to adapt to America so well, it's adopted American Islamophobia. And so we've got to go ahead and say, you know what, be the model, be the ideal, and don't actually adopt our bad American ideals and sort of move beyond us so that we can use Hizmet as a social model, so that Americans can use Hizmet as a social model within themselves. And so this is the dehumanization process. It's just a basic chart that shows you how the basic, what we are not, the pushing away, can escalate to where it's demonization, satanization, where people are so morally excluded that they're imbued with this evil quality, so they're not even human. And it escalates, and it's just through that reinforcement of those negative stereotypes, through not going out there and getting the information about these other groups themselves. And so this is how it escalates. And this is also how the othering of other ethnic Muslims feeds the Islamophobia, and creates Muslims everywhere as evil, which I know is not Hizmet's intention. So if we can go ahead and stop that process, it can be even more inclusive. And again, like I said, sort of teach Americans something about inclusion and pluralism, which I think is a big and tough goal. So this is how Hizmet sort of disengages. It doesn't have a violent legacy, because even though nationalism and Turkish culture and Turkish ethnic traditions have engaged violence against Armenians and Kurds, they've gone ahead and reached out to those communities, right? And so they're disengaging the cultural traumatic memory that we talked about. And also they don't have these false boundaries because they go out and they reach for other communities, okay? And it's all of these. So Hizmet's not just Turkish, they are reaching out to other communities. My bone of contention with this is, and this is the next slide, is that when you reach out to these other communities where they do have cultural traumatic memory, there is this denial of the term genocide. And yes, I'm bringing up the G word, I know. Don't freak out, okay? I know it's a polarizing issue, but one of my informants said we need to acknowledge, their pain and suffering, and that's the Islamic thing to do, and he's absolutely right. But when you don't acknowledge the pain and suffering on the victim's terms, it's a denial of justice, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So I would urge I would urge sort of this getting over of the G word. I know, it's scary, okay? But in order to give the victims of such a horrible crime sort of that acknowledgement, and that will largely help to bridge. The previous panel was just talking about forgiveness and how important acknowledgement is. But you've got to acknowledge the atrocities and the things that were done on the victim's terms, okay? Otherwise, it's a denial. So, and Hizmet has been great at bridging those gaps, starting that process, and they are a model for their other Turkish countrymen that completely deny, that things are happening. So, Hizmet is a wonderful group for sort of making that initial step, and now I hope we can all move forward and push back together, and move us all forward in the right direction. So, through education, dialogue, and universal peace, the inclusion of difference rather than the exclusion or just the inclusion of similarities, and the admittance of past wrongs, Hizmet fosters that empathy. Okay, empathy is the main key goal here, because that is how you view others as human, because you view them like yourself. And so if we can, branch out from non-Abrahamic faiths, and non-Turkish Muslims, and justice on the victim's terms, I think it'll go ahead and really cement Hizmet identity in that pluralistic, altruistic manner that I know they believe themselves to be. So there won't be this discontinuity between the ideals and the behavior, which is really important in fostering the next generation and future generations of Hizmet followers and a pluralistic world, truly. And that's it. Thank you.